Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos, Daf Mem Gimel. We're right on top of the Amud. It says the Gemara Esvei, Abaye asked the following kasha of Rabbah. Now, what are we speaking about here? So the Gemara began with a statement from Rav Chisda who taught us a halacha. Just as we find in the Mishnah, one may not place a kli underneath a lit lamp in order to be makabel the shemen, to receive the oil which is dripping from this lamp, since the oil is muktzah. Similarly, says Rav Chisda, one may not place a kli underneath a tarnagolis, a hen, which is expected to lay an egg, since the egg which will be laid is muktzah, for reasons discussed in the beginning of Maseches Beitza. So one may not place a kli in that location, which will result in the muktzah item landing in the kli. However, he can place the kli on top of an egg already laid, in order to protect it from passerby. Now, what is the difference between both cases? Explains Rabbah. Let's focus on the source, on the shorish, on the root. What is the underlying principle here of this halacha? Says Rabbah, the point here is because one may not be metaltal a kli, ein kli nital. One may not move a kli ela litzorich, only for the sake to come and assist and aid and benefit litzorich davar nital. One cannot take a kli, move it for the sake of muktzah. It can only be noitel a kli for the sake of davar hanitel, for a non-muktzah item. Therefore, says Rabbah, a beitza that was born on Shabbos, that was laid on Shabbos, a beitza shenolta b'Shabbos, is considered to be muktzah. And therefore, one cannot move another item for the sake of that muktzah item. However, says Rabbah, if he's coming to protect it, to be matzel hatzola me'etzuya, a commonly taken precaution, that is mutter. That falls within the realm of tzorech Shabbos. So once again, just as we may not move muktzah on Shabbos, that is out of bounds. It is out of the realm of a ordinary Shabbos use. It's not considered to be shimush Shabbos. So the muktzah itself is out of bounds, and anything pertaining to the muktzah is out of bounds. One cannot take a kli and use it to assist, to help, to protect a muktzah item. However, says Rabbah, if this protection, if this precautionary measure, this hatzola, is something which is common, it's a common occurrence on Shabbos, he's expected to encounter this on Shabbos, that falls within the realm of tzorech Shabbos. That is not considered to be within the bounds of muktzah. Therefore, to cover over an egg which was laid on Shabbos is considered to be hatzola metzuya, a precaution which is commonly done, taken. It's hatzola metzuya, and therefore being metaltal a kli for that purpose is mutter, as was explained on Daf Beis on Beis. The Gemara will proceed with some kashas that Abaye challenged Rabbah with these mishnahs and brises, and this is another one in the list of kashas. Esvei, so Abaye asked the kasha of Rabbah, how could you maintain that a kli is allowed to be moved l'tzorech muktzah if provided only if it is l'tzorech a hatzola metzuya, a commonly occurring phenomenon where this precaution needs to be taken? Esvei, he asked the kasha in the following Mishnah. Koifin ka'ar, the Mishnah says, one may take a ka'ar, a bowl, and use it to cover over al haner, over a flame, shelo yoichas bekar, so it doesn't go ahead and set the kaira, the beam on fire. Says Abaye, why is this mutter? He's taking a kli and being metaltal tzorech, this flame which is muktzah. It's a tzorech muktzah. Answers the Gemara, Rebati gnichi. We're speaking about a room which has a low ceiling. The shchiach b'udleika, it's very common for the dleika, for the flame to set the beam on fire. It is common to have a dleika, fire, set in these homes. So this indeed is called hatzola metzuya, a commonly occurring phenomenon which requires the appropriate precautionary measures to be taken, and therefore this is mutter. Continues the Gemara, another kasha, Mishnah tells us that a beam which cracked on Shabbos, one may support it so it doesn't sag further. It can use besafsol, it can use a bench, a baruch samita with bedposts. So here too he's being metaltal, a kli, to come to the assistance of a muktzah item, a kaira beam of the home which is muktzah. So why is this allowed? Says here too we're speaking about a hatzola metzuya, something which is a common phenomenon, a common occurrence. Big Shiur Chadati was speaking about newly installed beams which haven't yet been tested. Davidi Dipaki, they are liable to crack. As Rashi says, once the weight is put on them, they're very liable to go and crack. So therefore, this indeed is considered to be Hatzolah Matsuya, a common occurrence, and does not fall within the realms of Muktzah to take an item and use it to support these beams. Continues the Gemara with another kasha. We learned Noisen Kli Tachas HaDelef b'Shabbos. When we place a Kli underneath a leak on Shabbos. Now this delef, this leaking liquid, is not usable on Shabbos, not drinkable. It's Muktzah. So how can one use a Kli to collect this delef? Says the Gemara, Bebati Chadati was speaking about a newly constructed home. The Shchichi, the Dalfi, it is common for leaks to take place in these newly constructed homes, and therefore this also is considered to be Hatzolah Mitzuya. So once again, we conclude with Rabba's approach. Rabba explains to us that although a Kli is not meant to be moved, Litzorich HaMuktzah, but that only applies to a Hatzolah She'ena Mitzuya. But a Hatzolah Mitzuya, if he's coming to protect from a loss, which is something which occurs commonly, that's considered to be a Tzarech Shabbos. That doesn't fall into the realm of Muktzah. Rav Yosef Amar, Rav Yosef suggests a different approach to Rav Chizda's halacha. Rav Chizda explained to us that a Kli cannot be placed underneath an egg because the egg is Muktzah. However, it can be placed over the egg to protect it. Rav Yosef Amar, I'll give you another explanation to Rav Chizda. Hainu time with Rav Chizda. It has nothing to do with the halacha of ein kli nital ela letzorich davar nital, that a kli may only be moved for a non-muksa item, but rather it's based on another principle altogether. Mishum dekamevatel kli meyachanai, because by placing a kli under a muksa item, he's actually nullifying the use of the kli. It's going to be stuck there. You can't move it when it has the muksa item on it. So he's mimavatel, he's nullifying the kli, the use of the kli, meyachanai, from its designation, meaning from its use. He's nullifying the use. He's changing the status of the kli. And Rashi gives us a description of Melechas Boinet as though he's cementing it into place, because when he puts the kli there and it's stuck in place, it's as though he built it in, as though he cemented it in. It's like Melechas Boinet. Elsewhere, Rashi says it's like Melechas Soiser, because he's dismantling the kli, dismantling the use of the kli. He's rendering it useless. So that is the reason why one may not place a kli underneath dripping oil, which is muktzah, underneath an egg, which is muktzah, because he's being mavatel kli meyechanai from its designation. So, according to Rav Yosef, it's very pashut. Why, although he can't place it underneath the muktzah, he certainly can place it over the muktzah. Because in that case, he's not doing anything to the kli. He's not nullifying the use of the kli. He can just pick up the kli and walk away with it whenever he chooses. He's not changing the status of the kli. Says the Gemara, Eisvei Abaye. So Abaye asked him, Akasha, from the following Mishnahs, from the following Brises, you maintain that one cannot be mavatel kli? Is that so? We learned, Chavish shel tevel, a barrel which contained tevel, which is muktzah, shenishbra, which broke, which burst, maybe kli acher, one can bring another kli, umeniach tachteh, place underneath, to collect the contents of the chavis. So how can he do that? He's being mavata kli meyachanai, because the tevel, which is muktzah, is entering this kli, is being received by this kli, and now the kli, which contains muktzah, cannot be moved. Says the Gemara, Amar lei. So Rav Yosef responded, Tevel muchnu etzel Shabbos. Although one may not eat tevel in its current present state before the Tumas and Maises were separated, nevertheless, tevel doesn't really have the same degree of intensity of muktzah like other muktzah items. It is muchnu etzel Shabbos. It is prepared for Shabbos. Why? Because potentially speaking, this tevel can become permitted on Shabbos. How? If one goes ahead and transgresses the Issa D'Rabban, who prohibited separating Trumas and Maises from tevel, because it is a tikkun, he's fixing the food, so that's an Issa D'Rabban. But if somebody chooses to be over to transgress the Issa D'Rabban, what's going to happen? Masukan, the tevel becomes fit and rendered fit for consumption. it's mutter to eat it. So an Issa Rabban was executed, the tevel becomes mutter. Says Rabbi Yosef, if so, when tevel lands in a kli, you can't say the kli became nullified, because the actual tevel itself is not really inherently muktzah. The chefts of the tevel is not really muktzah, because the reason why it's aser is simply because one is prevented from being mafresh to Mr. Ma'aser on account of his Rabbanan. But technically speaking, potentially speaking, this tevel can be mutter on Shabbos as well. Perhaps if somebody's over an Isser Rabbanan, maybe b'mezer or b'shay, he didn't know it's an Isser. In either case, this just drives home the point that the tevel is not inherently a muktzah item, and therefore you can't say that when tevel lands on a kli, the kli becomes nullified from its use, the shimush becomes batel, the kli becomes batel. It's not absolute. It's only as long as the tevel remains aser. Therefore, this does not fall into the category of v'mevatel kli meichana. Continues the Gemara. So he asked him another kasha. We learned noisen kli tachas haner lekabel nitzotzos. One may go ahead and take a kli, put it under the lamp to receive, to deflect, to be makabel the sparks that are flying. Now the sparks are muktzah. According to Rav Yosef, how can he do that? He's b'mevatel kli. He's taking this kli, placing it underneath the sparks, and rendering the kli unfit for use because it's going to have the muktzah on it. Amar Avuna ben Rav Shua, nitzotzos ein b'en mamish. Sparks have no significance, have no chashivas, and as soon as they go out, one can be metaltal the kli. So although when there's still burning sparks, one can't move the kli because he's actually moving the sparks by moving the kli. But once the sparks go out a second later, they have no significance, they have no chashivas, and he can go ahead and resume moving his kli. So this way, it's not considered that the kli is batel. He's not being mevatel kli meichana. As soon as they go out, he'll be able to use the kli again. So here we don't have the problem of mevatel kli meichana. Continues the Gemara. So we learned another halacha. V'chein koyer shenishbara, a beam which cracked, which broke. Soim chinoisa, it can support the beam. B'safsol, using a bench. B'ruchas hamita, using a bedpost. Here too, once he wedges the safsol or the bedpost in a manner which is in a tight manner, which is holding up this beam, he's committing the item. He's committing this kli into that location, committing it to supporting this beam, and he's being mevatel the kli over there. He's not going to take it out, certainly not on Shabbos. So he's being mevatel kli meichana. He's nullifying its use. He's designating, he's committing it for the sake of holding up this beam. Says Umar de Rafi was speaking about that it's loose. He's not wedging it in. He's merely leaving it there. He's supporting it loosely. If he would like, he can take it out. And as the Balmar explains, he has kavanah, he has intention to take it out. So here, although we're not speaking about turning the safsol or the aruchas amita into a muksa item, he's not making it usher by wedging it in there. But nevertheless, since he's committing it for that purpose, he's nullifying its use. He's not going to use it anymore as an ordinary bed or a bench. That was the Gemara's kasha. He's mevatel its use. Says the Gemara, since he's putting it there merely loosely, rafi, and as the Balmar points out, he has the intention of removing it there soon, from there soon. Therefore, it's not considered to be mevatel kli. He's not nullifying the kli. Continues the Gemara another kasha. Noisen kli tachas hadelaf b'Shabbos. We learned the halacha. One may place a kli underneath a leak on Shabbos, even though the leak is not drinkable, it's not usable, it's muktzah. How can he place a kli underneath the delaf? He's mevatel the kli meichana. Answers the Gemara b'delaf haroi. We're speaking about evidently a leak which is roi. Rashi says roi l'shtiya, it's drinkable, therefore it's not muktzah. Says the Gemara another kasha on Rav Yosef. Koifen es hasal l'fnei freichen. One may take a basket and turn it upside down in front of the young birds so that they can use it as a stepladder, shiyal of yerdu, to go up and down using this basket, go up to their birdhouse or whatever. So they're allowed to use this basket, even though we know that the Yifroichem, a Baal Chai, is Muktzah on Shabbos. So how can you go ahead and place the basket there? Since the Yifroichem are using it, they're going to be standing on it, they're going to be making it Muktzah unfit for use, he's being mavatal the kli meichane. Says the Merkasavar mutal taltal. He holds that one is allowed to be mataltal this sal, this basket, even after he positioned it in this manner. Vatani, but we learned asal taltal. One may not move it. Says Rabbi Olav. That's only because the birds are actually on the sal. When they're on it, he can't move it. But as soon as they go off, he'll go ahead and use the sal again, and therefore it's not considered to be mevata kli meichane. It's only something temporary. Tosfos points out there's actually an additional mitigating factor here, because he can always chase the birds away. It's within his power to get rid of the muktzah at any moment that he wishes. Therefore, this is not considered to be mevata kli meichane. Says more, is that so? That it can use the sal once the birds jumped off. But haven't we learned? Even when the Efraichim are not actually on the basket is still muktzah. That's speaking about a unique case. That's speaking about when the birds were on the baskets, when? Bein hashmoshes, during the first period of Shabbos, at the onset, the commencement of Shabbos. And the halach is that the halachas of muktzah are determined by when? By what's happening at the first moment of Shabbos. If something is considered to be muktzah at that moment, the halachic determination of muktzah carries through the whole Shabbos. That is the benchmark. What's going on during Ben Hashmoshes? Migu diskatzoi Ben Hashmoshes, since it became muktzah Ben Hashmoshes, because the birds were present on this basket at that moment, it becomes muktzah for the entire day of Shabbos. So the halacha of muktzah depends on the Ben Hashmoshes. So that's the pshat in that brisa. The brisa says, even when the Efraichim are not on the basket, they're not present on it, the basket still remains asur. That's because they were there during Ben Hashmoshes. And the status of muktzah was applied then, at that moment, and carries throughout the entire Shabbos. However, in ordinary circumstances where the Efraichim were not there during Ben Hashmoshes, but rather hopped onto the basket later on, throughout Shabbos, then it's only a temporary muktzah. As soon as he shoos them away, you can go ahead and use this basket again. And that is the case of that halacha of koifen es asal fnei Efraichim. The halacha that one may go ahead and turn this basket over for the sake of the birds climbing up and down on it, is because the Efraichim were not there during Ben Hashmoshes, and the sal does not become muktzah. It's only when the Efraichim are on it. But as soon as they go off, it's not muktzah any longer, so therefore it's not considered to be annulling, being mavatal, the use of the kli. It's only a temporary situation. As Tosfos points out, he always has within his power to chase them away. So therefore it's not considered to be mavatal kli meichane. So once again, we have halacha from Rav Chisda, who told us that one may not place a kli underneath a muktzah egg, but may place it on top of a muktzah egg. We have two approaches. We have Rabbah and we have Rav Chisda. Continues the Gemara, there's actually an opposing view. There's a man who is chaylik on Rav Chisda, on Rav Yitzchak. Kishem she'ein noisen kli. Just like one may not place a kli underneath tachas antarnegos, underneath the hen, lekabel beitzasa, to receive the falling egg, which is muktzah. And this is learned from our Mishnah, which tells us that a kli may not be placed under the dripping oil, which is muktzah. Kach, in the same token, ein koifen oleh kli b'shvil shloi teshaver. One may not take a kli and put it over the muktzah item, over the egg, to protect it from breakage. Why? Says the Gemara, kasavar, because Rav Yitzchak holds. What is the underlying principle here? It is because kasavar ein kli nitel, ela ledavar nitel b'Shabbos. A kli is not to be moved unless ela ledavar, if it's coming for the sake, for the purpose to aid and assist, ledavar, another item nitel b'Shabbos, which can be moved on Shabbos, meaning a non-muktzah item. Just as we may not move muktzah itself, we may not come to aid and to service muktzah. It's also part of the Isser muktzah. Therefore, it's irrelevant whether he's placing it underneath the egg or on top of the egg. Either way, he's being mataltal kli to protect, to assist a muktzah item, and that is considered to be part of the realm, of the category of Isser muktzah. Says the Gemara, Meisvei, Kol Hani Tiyufta. So the Gemara asks all these kashas from the Mishnahs, from the Brises, which seem to indicate that yes, under certain circumstances, one may go ahead and take a kli and come to aid another item which is muktzah. Vishani, and he answers, B'tzarech l'mkaimai. Rabbi Yitzchak will answer, or Rabbi Yitzchak did answer, that was speaking about B'tzarech l'mkaimai. What means is as follows, that he didn't pick up the item. All these mishnahs was not speaking about that he picked up the item with the intent purpose of coming to the assistance of the muktzah item. For instance, the case where he's taking a ka'ara, a bowl, and covering with it a flame, so the beam on top of it doesn't catch fire. Rav Yitzchak will learn that the reason why he picked up the bowl was not for that purpose, not for the kavanah to cover over the flame, but rather b'tzarech l'mkaimai. He needed to use the place where this bowl was sitting. He needed the makam. So lifting the bowl in these circumstances is a shimush heter. It's a valid shimush on Shabbos. It's permitted. It's perfectly okay. Therefore, once he got involved in a meleches, in a maisa heter, in a tiltal heter, moving the item initially was for a valid reason, for a shimush heter on Shabbos. Once he's holding it, Rav Yitzchak holds, once he's holding it in his hand, he can go ahead and place it anywhere which he wishes. He can go ahead and cover with it a flame, or as the Gemara discussed, collecting tevel, collecting the leak from the roof. All these cases are speaking about the same identical scenario where he already picked up the item for a valid purpose. For instance, he needed to use the place where that item was sitting on. Therefore, it is totally mutter to do that. So since the initial involvement with this kli was l'tzarech davar hamutter, for a valid reason, for the sake of tzarech Shabbos, once he's holding it, he can go ahead and complete this tilta, he can complete this act, and place it anywhere where he would like. Now, what is the reason for this heter? So, actually, the Rambam explains what is the root cause for the Issa Muktzah. What is the reason why Chacham Geyser made this takana of Muktzah on Shabbos? The Rambam gives several reasons. He says it's meant to safeguard one from getting himself involved in handling tools and all kinds of items which are intended to be used for malachos, lest he come to do malachos on Shabbos. The Rambam gives another reason, because the involvement of Shabbos, the activities on Shabbos are meant to be visibly different than ordinary weekday activities. He's meant to display Shvisas Shabbos, resting of Shabbos, by his activities and lack of involvement with items that are meant to be used for malachos. So we can understand, it's very reasonable that only prevents one from initially involving himself and engaging in involvement with tools, with all types of kelim that are meant to be used for malachos. But if he's already holding in his hands, his initial engagement and involvement with this item was for the sake of shimush of Shabbos, or tzarech heter. It was not a weekday activity, it was not a malach activity. So once the initial involvement was permitted, was a valid involvement, was a Shabbos involvement, so that sets the tone for the entire act. The nature of this act has already taken on a positive nature. It's considered to be a tzarech Shabbos, and therefore any subsequent completion of that act is just merely a conclusion of this initial tzarech Shabbos. It doesn't take on a life of its own. It's merely considered to be a conclusion of this tzarech Shabbos. Once again, since the initial involvement was a tzarech Shabbos, therefore it can simply conclude it in any manner which he sees fit. Therefore, says Rabbi Yitzchak, even though I don't allow one to be metaltel a kli for the sake of muktzah, but once he lifts this kli for the sake of tzarech Shabbos, if he needs it, or he needs its location, he needs its makam, therefore once he's holding it, and his engagement, his involvement, his activity is considered to be a tzarech Shabbos, he can go ahead and complete this maisa and place it anywhere which he wishes. He can even use it to collect a dvar muktzah, or to protect a dvar muktzah. So let's take a quick chazorah here, just take stock where we're holding at this point. We have a machlokes between Rav Chizda and Rav Yitzchak. Let's start again with Rav Chizda. He says that one may not place a kli underneath a muktzah, but he can use it to cover a muktzah item. We have two explanations. We have Rabbah and Rav Yosef. Rabbah tells us this halach is based on a principle that a kli is not nitel. Ein kli nitel ella l'tzarech davar nitel. One cannot be nitel a kli l'tzarech muktzah. Therefore, you can't place it underneath a muktzah egg. However, says Rava, when we have a hatzolah metzuya, we have a commonly occurring loss, and he's meant to take a precaution against that loss. That is mutter. That is considered to be within the realm of tzarech Shabbos. Therefore, he can place a kli on top of a beitza, in order that the public doesn't trample upon it and crush it. Rav Yosef has a different approach. He says, what is the base reason here? What is the underlying principle? Is because one is not allowed to be mavatel kli meichanai, to nullify a kli from its use, render it useless on Shabbos. It's like seiser, it's like baina, whatever reason. And therefore, even for hatzolah metzuya, it's aser. There's no heter. However, all those mishnas and brises, which seem to indicate that one is allowed to be mavatel kli meichanai, the Gemara gave various answers that for whatever reason, all those cases do not involve. This principle does not apply in all those cases. He's not considered to be nullifying the kli from its use. So that's all according to the Shita of Rechizah. Rav Yitzchak disagrees. He says, just as we may not place a kli underneath a muktzah, so too it may not be placed on top of a muktzah to protect it. And again, why? Because Rav Yitzchak is following the reason of ein kli nitel. One cannot move a kli l'tzorech a muktzah item. Therefore, it's irrelevant whether he's placing underneath it or on top of it, except in a case where he lifted the kli l'tzorech davar hamutar. For instance, if he needed the place where the kli was sitting on, so that was a valid, legitimate reason for picking up that kli. Once he engaged in that ma'aseh tiltil be'heter, he can go conclude it in any which manner which he sees fit. So the Gemara will proceed asking kashas on Rav Yitzchak. Toshma, come and listen to the following kasha. Echaz beitza shenolda b'Shabbos, an egg which was laid on Shabbos. V'echaz beitza shenolda b'Yom Tov, was laid on Yom Tov. Ein metaltlan, so it's muktzah, one may not move it. Loi l'chasas b'as hakli, not to use it to cover the opening of a kli. Or lismech bo karei amita, to support with it the legs of a bed. So Rashi explains that when an egg is positioned upright, lengthwise upright, it has such resistance. It can actually support a very large load. You could even theoretically use it to support a bed. So the Brisa tells us that a beitza, which is muktzah, cannot be used for that purpose. Avol koifa le'kli b'shvil shloi teshavar. One can take a kli and place it upside down over this beitza to protect it from harm. Says the Gemara, according to you, Rav Yitzchak, how can he do that? He's being metaltal kli for muktzah. Hachanami, says the Gemara here too, is speaking of tzarech l'mkaimai. He lifts the kli for a legitimate reason because he needs its place. It's tzarech Shabbos. Once he's holding it, he can use it to cover the egg. Tashma, another kasha. Person machzoles al gabavanim b'Shabbos. He can be purse machzoles. He can spread mats over rocks on Shabbos to protect it from rain, from getting muddy. Although the rocks are muktzah, how can he do that? How can he take a machzeles for the sake of muktzah? Says the Gemara, we're speaking about non-muktzah rocks, rocks which are pointy, the chazil and beis hakisa, which can be used for wiping oneself in the bathroom. So it's not muktzah, and therefore there's no problem. Tashma, another kasha. One can spread mats over bricks on Shabbos. The bricks are muktzah. Says the Gemara, it's not muktzah. They were left over from construction, and they're not muktzah. The chazyon, they're fit, they're usable, to lean on them, and they're not muktzah. Tashma, another kasha. Person machzelos, one may spread a mat al gabe kaveres dvarim, on top of a beehive. B'Shabbos, on Shabbos. B'chama, why is he doing it? B'chama pnei achama, in the summer to protect it from the sun. U'b'ksham pnei aksham, in the winter to protect it from rain. U'b'lvach le'iskav lotzit, provided that he doesn't intend on trapping those bees inside. Says the Gemara, according to Rav Yitzchak, how can he go ahead and use these mats, be mataltal these mats, to protect the beehive and cover over those bees which are muktzah? Says the Gemara, we're speaking about the ikadvash. There's honey contained in these beehives. If so, the honey is not muktzah, and therefore he can take the machzeles to protect the honey. Okay. So this is understandable in the summertime, when indeed there is honey present in the beehive, which is in muktzah. However, in the winter time that there's no honey present, how are you going to explain this halacha? When there's no honey present, all we have left are the bees, which are muktzah. How can you go ahead and bring a mat to cover over the bees? Says must be speaking about we're speaking about those two chales, those are two honeycombs, which the beekeeper actually leaves in the beehive to allow the bees to feed on the honey throughout the winter time. So those two chales will be present even during winter time. So even though the bees it seems are not producing any honey during winter time, but those two chales are present and they are not muktzah because they're edible. It's honey. Says the Gemara, but they too are muktzah. Why are they muktzah? Because they're designated for the use of the bees, to sustain the bees, not meant for human consumption. Says about the chashiv alayu, speaking about that he planned on eating them. So before Shabbos he already planned on using them for personal use, and therefore it's not muktzah. Okay, so that's pshat in the halacha. One can take a machzelas to cover over the beehive, which contains the honey. In the summer we have honey. In the winter we have at least these two honeycombs, and we're speaking about that he intended to use it for himself, for human consumption, and it is not muktzah. Says the Gemara, okay, so this implies that otherwise it wouldn't be allowed, otherwise it's muktzah. So you insinuate that otherwise, if he had not planned on using them, you're going to say asur? Is it asur? It's asur to place the mat over this beehive because there's only muktzah in there. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, why does the Brisa, when the Brisa is proceeding and stipulating a halacha, a precaution, you must know, says the Brisa, provided he can place the mat, but provided that he has no intention for to trap the bees. Why does the Brisa have to proceed with a provision concerning tzeda, which is an entirely different realm, different malacha? Why doesn't the Brisa simply make a distinction, a differentiation within this first clause, within this inherent halacha of muktzah? The Brisa should say like this: if that's the case, the Brisa proceeds with giving us a provision, a precaution that this heter is only applicable when he has no intention of trapping those bees. The Brisa should differentiate, should make a chiluk. Lifleg should split, make a differentiation, a distinction, and state a provision within the halachas of muktzah itself. When is this allowance? When is this permitted? Because he can only use those mats when he had intended, when he had planned on using those chalais dvash, those two honeycombs for personal use. In that case, it's not muktzah, and he can place those mats over the honeycomb. But when is this allowance? When does this apply? But otherwise, if he had not planned on using those chalais dvash, it's also because they're muktzah. So why doesn't the Brisa simply stipulate a distinction, a provision right here? The Brisa should state a precaution right here. You must know that this heter is only provided that there was a machshava to use those chalais, but otherwise it's muktzah. Why does the Brisa need to proceed to a different realm of tzeda and tell us that, well, this is okay, but tzeda? You have to be careful about tzeda. No, even this is not okay. Even this may involve muktzah, because this is only mutter when the chalas dvash were designated for personal use, but otherwise it's muktzah, and one may not cover it with the mats. Says the Kamashmon, the Brisa wants to teach us, wants to inform us. Even if yes, he had planned on using those honeycombs, and it's not muktzah. So muktzah is out of the way, there's no concern about muktzah. Nevertheless, there's actually another concern, which you may not have known about, which is tzeda. Okay, so once again the Brisa is telling us that we have two concerns. We have muktzah, and that is addressed by designating this honey for personal use. We have a concern about tzeda. He must make sure that he has no intention of trapping these bees. So even though he's placing the mats over the honeycomb, as long as he has no kavanah, there's no intent purpose of trapping those bees, it's mutter. The Gemara will analyze these two items and see if they're compatible, if they work with each other. Says Ramani, who's the author of this brisa? Meaning, whose shita does this brisa follow? When the brisa tells us that it's sufficient, that he has no kavanah for tzeda. Apparently, even though tzeda is happening, the breeze are getting trapped, there's no concern because he has no machshav, he has no kavanah for it. He's merely trying to protect his beehive, even though this results in a incidental malacha taking place of tzeda. Since this wasn't his kavanah, it's mutter. Mani, who are we following? Reb Shimon. Are we following Reb Shimon, who holds that a davar shein meskaven is mutter? If one performs an act, a maisa, which results in a malacha taking place, it's mutter as long as he has no kavanah for that malacha. It is not malachas machshavas. If so, says the Gemara, we understand this part of the brisa. Understand this concern, this halacha, that as long as there's no kavanah, it's okay. But why did you need to say that he had intention, he had machshava to use those honeycombs? According to Reb Shimon, Reb Shimon less lay muksa. He doesn't apply the concept of muksa in this case. Now, although Reb Shimon, both Reb Shimon and Reb Yehuda both agree to the concept of muksa, theoretically there is a concept of muksa, but there is a machlekes between them. This will be discussed starting from Daf Mem Daled, next blot, that there's a big machlekes with regard to the application of muksa. How broadly we want to apply the concept of muksa. Says the Gemara, according to Reb Shimon, muksa will not apply in this case, since the honey is technically edible, even though it was designated for the consumption of the bees. It's not designated for human consumption. Nevertheless, muksa will not apply in this case. And when we move it on Shabbos, it's not muktzah. So why did you need to say that the Brisa is speaking about that he designated for personal use? Once again, either of Shimon, if we're following Reb Shimon, Leslie muktzah. Muktzah does not apply in this case. So apparently these two factors can't go hand in hand. We can't say, number one, he needs to designate it for personal use. Number two, as long as he has no kavanah for tzeda, it's okay. That would seem to apply with following Shita Reb Shimon, but according to Reb Shimon, there's no muktzah here. Reb Yehuda, if we're following the Shita of Yehuda, who indeed applies the concept of muktzah in this case, since the honey was designated for the use of the bees, it's considered to be off limits on Shabbos, and it's muktzah. If that's the case, okay, but how's the other factor going to fit in here? The Brisa says that if he places the mats without any intention, any kavanah to trap those bees, it's mutter. According to Yehuda, that's not so. Yehuda kiloi meskaven mayavi. Even without kavan, it's still asur. Davar shein meskaven asur. According to Yehuda, even a davar shein meskaven is asur. If one does a ma'aseh which results in a malacha taking place, even if he has no intention to perform that malacha, it's also asur. So either way, we're stuck. These two factors can't go hand in hand. Number one factor, that he needs to have the machshava to use those two chaleis dvash, those two honeycombs for personal use, for human consumption. That's the first factor, in order to remove the muktzah concern. And number two, he can place those mats, since he has no kavanah to trap the bees. Those two factors don't go hand in hand. According to Reb Shimon, the factor of Ein Meskaven works, but the muktzah is not a consideration. According to Yehuda, the muktzah is a consideration. But the Ein Meskaven, the fact that he has no kavanah, doesn't help us in any way. Even in that case, it's asur. Says in Olam, truthfully, Rabbi Yehuda, we're discussing Shittas Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore muktzah is a concern, and he must have machshava. He must designate, must plan on using these chaleis dvash ahead of time before Shabbos. He must have that machshava before Shabbos to use this for personal consumption. Says more again, La'olam Rabbi Yehuda, we're following Shittas Rabbi Yehuda, so muktzah works. What about the point of Ein Meskaven? How does the Brisa allow one to place the mat on the honeycomb, on the hive, on the beehive, provided that he has no intention of trapping the bees? Apparently, he's trapping those bees. So, how does the lack of kavanah address that problem? Says the Gemara, we must reinterpret those words. My ubavad shlo yiskaven lotzid. What does the Brisa mean to say? As long as he has no kavanah, no intention to trap, shlo yaseh no kimetzuda. It's merely saying that he may place those mats in a manner, in a fashion, where he doesn't form a trap here. The lishbik lo ravcha, he must leave a space open, so that the bees don't get trapped on their own. It's very simple. Both factors work very well. Number one, according to Yehuda, he must have had a machshava from before Shabbos to eventually use these honeycombs for personal use, whenever, whether Shabbos, whether after Shabbos, doesn't matter, as long as he has kavanah to use it for personal use, that kavanah is to take place before Shabbos arrives. And that removes the concern of muktzah. When the Brisa tells us he can place the mats as long as he doesn't trap, we're speaking about physically not trapping them. Practically, he's not trapping them. And therefore, there's no concern of tzeidah. Now, one point that we must point out is that according to Reb Shimon, we know, even though a davar she'ein meskaven is mutter, but that's only if it's not a psik reisha. If it's not inevitable, but if the malacha is inevitable, according to Reb Shimon, it's also asur. It's a mashal like cutting off the head of a chicken. You can't say, well, I'll cut it off and it won't die. It's inevitable. So, apparently, the fact that the Gemara was okay with this halacha according to Reb Shimon, apparently we're not speaking about that it's inevitable that they get trapped. He's covering the beehive with the mats, but he's leaving a little space where it's not inevitable to get trapped. Perhaps they will, perhaps they won't. So it's not inevitable, and therefore, according to Reb Shimon, that's okay. The Gemara points out, according to Reb Yehuda, that's not sufficient. He must ensure that those bees won't get trapped. He must leave a large space to make sure that they're not trapped inside. Okay, so this sums up the first approach on the Brisa. We had a kasha. How can you go and take those mats to cover the beehive? It's muktzah. Says the Gemara, there's honey in there. Honey? That's only in the summer. In the winter, they don't produce honey. Says the Gemara, in the winter as well, there's honey because of those two honeycombs that he leaves in there for the sustenance of the bees. The Gemara discussed Shitas of Yehuda, and therefore he needs to designate those chalas dvash for personal use, and he must make sure not to trap those bees. Says Rav Ashi Amar, Rav Ashi is going to have a different answer, a different teretz to the kasha. What was the kasha again? How can he cover the beehive, which is muktzah? Because in the winter, there's no honey there. And the Brisa clearly tells us that he may cover the beehive b'chama, b'pnei achama, or b'kshamim in the wintertime on account of the ksham of the rains. Says Rav Ashi, the definition of those words are different. Miktani b'mois achama, b'mois akshamim. Does the Brisa speak about seasons? Does the Brisa say that in the summer he's covering it on account of the sun, in the winter on account of the rains? We're not speaking about summer and winter. The Mishnah is not, the Brisa is not discussing summer and winter at all. We're speaking about in the sunlight, when the beehive is present in the sun, b'chama, he's going to protect it on account of the sun. Or b'kshamim, when it's raining, on account of the rain. That's what the Brisa is speaking about. Once again, Rav Ashi Amar Miktani, does it say b'mois achama, b'mois aksham? Doesn't say that. It says b'chama, in the sun, b'pnei achama, he's protecting from the sun. Or b'kshamim, during the rainstorm, b'pnei akshamim ktani. We're speaking about b'yomi Nisan, or b'yomi Tishrei. We're speaking about Nisan time and Tishrei time, in the spring and the fall, the ikachama. There is sun present. Sometimes the weather features sun, a sunny day. Sometimes it's raining. And indeed, there's honey present in the honeycomb during those periods of the year. So very simple. The Brisa is speaking about a honeycomb, a beehive, which contains honey. We're not speaking about the winter. You're right, in the winter there's no honey there, and it's asur. So once again, in summary, the Brisa tells us one may spread over a mat onto a beehive. The Brisa says b'kshamim as well. Why? Bilvad shalei iskaven latzid, as long as he doesn't intend on trapping the bees. We have two approaches. Number one, we're speaking about in the summer or in the winter. But in the winter, there's no honey there. Says the Gemara, we're speaking of those two chalis, which are present. And he was machashiv aleim. He intended to use it for human consumption, and it's not muktzah. The Brisa tells us this is allowed, provided that he positions those mats in a manner where he doesn't trap those bees. Because we're following Shitas of Yehuda who holds of muktzah. And therefore he needs to, number one, have kavana, machshava, to use those two chalis for personal use. Number two, he must make sure that he allows those bees to escape. Because even though he has no kavana to trap them, that would be asur. The second approach in the Gemara was, we're not speaking about winter time, we're speaking about b'yomi Nisan, b'yomi Tishrei, when we have the weather can feature a sunny day, a rainy day, and he's protecting it from the sun and the rain. And certainly during those times of the year, dvash, edible honey, is present in this beehive, which is not muktzah, and therefore this allows one to cover it with mats. Continues the Gemara. So once again, Rav Yitzchak held that one may not be metaltal a kli l'tzoyrech amuktzah. He was stating this halacha dispute of Rav Chizda, who allowed one to take a kli to cover muktzah item, as we discussed up until now. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Sheshes announced, Puku, go out, Amar Rav Yitzchak, go tell Rav Yitzchak, Kfar Tirgema, Rav Huna l'shmaitach b'Bavel. Rav Huna already expounded, elaborated, taught your halacha in Bavel. What was your halacha? That one may not take an item, be metaltal a kli, to use it for the sake of a muktzah item. Rav Huna already said the same thing in Bavel. Amar Rav Huna, so he's coming to support Rav Yitzchak. He's saying Rav Huna actually holds like you. The Amar Rav Huna, where do we see this halacha? Amar Rav Huna, oisen mechitza l'meis v'shel chai. One may erect a partition, oisen mechitza l'meis, for the sake of a mace to benefit a dead person, b'shvil chai, if he does it, to benefit a person who's alive. Ve'ein oisin mechitza l'meis, b'shvil meis. But he cannot make a mechitza for the mace if it's done for the mace. Seems like a cryptic statement. Says what does he mean? He means as follows: the Omar of Shmuel bar Yehuda, v'chein tana shilamari. Shilamari also taught us regarding the following halach: mace hamutal b'chama. If we have a mace who's lying in the sun, and there's a concern that it will spoil, what are we meant to do? Halach is as follows: boim shnei bnei adam. Two people can show up. V'yosh mitzidai, and each one there will be one sitting on each side of the mace. So it gets hot on the bottom, the floor is hot. So what are they going to do? So each one will bring a bed and sit down on the bed to protect him, to separate between him and the insulate him from protect him from the heat of the earth below. So Ruvain brings a bed for his own sake and sits down on it. Vizeh and Shimon, sitting on the other side of the maze, does the same. Maybe Mita brings a bed, V'yoshev sits down on the bed. Okay. Chamlem lomala, it gets sunny from on top. Mevi machzelas, they bring a mat. Upois nalein, and they spread it over their heads. They lift it up in the air. So they're standing there with the machzelas up in the air. Zeh zoikef mitase. So now Reuven will take his bed and erect it upright, and will use it as a support for the machzelas, for the mat, which is over him. Vanishmat, and then he could slip away by and he disappears. Vizeh, and Shimon does the same. Zoikif mitase, he lifts up his bed, he erects it, stands it upright, to place the machzelas above it. Vanishmat v'hoylachloi, slips away and goes away. Vanimtzes, and as a result, mechitza suimele, we have the mechitza, the awning. We have the beds on the sides, we have the awning on top. Mechitza asumiyela, it's done on its own. We accomplished we created an awning on its own, meaning it was done for the benefit of the chai, of the living person. And although their intent purpose was to aid and benefit, to protect the mace, it's okay because they derive hana and pleasure from it. So this is the meaning of the halacha that we said earlier, that one may make a mechitza for the sake of a mace, bishvil chai, if he's doing it initially for the benefit of a chai. Because one cannot be noy oisa mechitza lemeis b'shul meis, because one cannot be a taltal an item directly to benefit a mace. It must be done indirectly. It must be done first, initially, to benefit a live person, a chai. One cannot be metaltal kli l'tzorich a mace who is muktzah. So this concurs with the Shiur of Yitzchak that a kli cannot be moved for the sake of muktzah. Now Tosfos points out, Tosfos asks, why do they have to do it in stages? First they brought the bed, then they brought the mat. So Tosfos, because the Chacham wanted to ensure that it's done in a way which is obvious and visible, that it's being done l'tzorech to benefit the chai. So they must do it incrementally in stages. First they meet us, sit down on it, and then bring the machzelas, so that it should be nicker, it should be a heker that is l'tzorech chai, doing it for their own sake. Rashi points out another point based on the Gemara in Be'er, that why did they have to do it backwards? Why did they have to first lift the mat up on top and then erect the bed to use as a support? They're doing it from top down rather than bottom up, says Rashi. Yes, that is a necessity. They have to do it in that way. Why? Because we know that one may not erect an oil kavua on Shabbos, a permanent awning, a permanent tent, a roof. That is a melacha on Shabbos. However, an oil harai, merely a temporary tent, that is only in a Siddur Rabbanan. And if it's done derech shinoi, in an ordinary manner, something of an unusual way, it's mutter. Says Rashi, therefore they had to do it backwards. First they had to lift the machzelos up in the air, and while they were holding up in the air, they placed the support underneath it, so they were working milamalu lamata, from top down rather than from bottom up. It was derech shinoi, and therefore it's mutter. Continues the Gemara. Itma we learned. Meis hamutal b'chama. If we have a mace who's lying in the sun, what are we meant to do? Rav Yehuda Mashmol, hoifchay memitel mita. He's meant to roll the mace from one bed to the other. Lying on a bed, he can take that bed and roll the mace over to another bed until he gets it into the shade. So he can't actually lift the mace directly because it's muktzah, but he can roll him by touching the bed, by lifting and tilting the bed. So that's one sheet. Rav Chanina bar Shlamya Mishmei Rav Amar, Maniach Olav Kikar or Tinok, he can place on the mace a kikar, a loaf of bread, or a tinok, or a child, and move the mace in that manner. Metaltaloi. Because the mace is considered like a basis for serving the Dvar Heter, the Kikar and the Tinok. It's basil, Davar Mutter. It's like a basis, support for a mutter item, for a permissible item, and therefore that's allowed. And of course, this is only in Heter, specifically applied by the Chachamim to a mace, on account of kavod, honor of the mace, because he's lying in the sun. So we have two shittas here, where Yehuda tells us that you roll the mace from one bed to the other. You are metaltal it in an indirect manner. We have Rav Chanino tells us we're meant to use the kikar or the tinnik and place it on the mace and be metaltal the mace in that manner. The Gemara will analyze the machlokes. Heichad ika kikar tinnik. When he has access to the loaf of bread or to a tinnik, kuli amli pliga dishari, all agree that it's mutter. It's mutter to be metaltal the mace in this manner. Ki pligi, when then is there machlokes? The last lay, when he doesn't have access to these items. If so, he must go ahead and roll the mace from one bed to the other. Is that allowed? Mar savar, so Rav Chanina holds that's not allowed. Tiltul min atzad, an indirect contact and moving of muktzah, tiltul min atzad, derech shinoi, shmei tiltul. That is deemed tiltul. That's considered to be handling muktzah, even if it's indirectly. Therefore, he can't roll the mace by tilting the bed and rolling it from one bed to the other. Umar savar. However, Yehuda holds lo shmei tiltul. Handling muktzah min atzad in an unusual manner is not considered to be tiltul muktzah. Let's remember the point of muktzah is don't get involved with your tools, with your items that are used for malacha on Shabbos. Don't engage with them. Don't get involved in them. Now that only applies to direct engagement, direct handling. But if he's doing it in a manner which is unusual, which is not the ordinary way of handling the muktzah item, said Rav Yehuda, that's tiltul min atzad, that's not asur on Shabbos. Says Gemara, perhaps this concept of whether or not indirect usage of muktzah is considered to be muktzah, perhaps this is based on a machlokes tanoim. Says the Bryce, one may not save the mace from a fire. Omar Vida ben Lakish, Shamati, I heard, one can rescue the mace from a fire. Says, well, let's analyze this. Hey Chidami, what are we speaking about? If there's a kikar or tinuk to place on the mace, my time at Tanakama. Why does Tanakama prohibit? If he has no kikar or tinuk, my time with Vidur ben Lakish. Why does Vidur ben Lakish permit handling the mace without a kikar or tinuk? Elalava must be, but tiltul min atzad pligi. We're speaking about handling the mace indirectly, like rolling it over from bed to bed, and that is the machlokes. The Mar Savar, the Tanakama holds. Tiltul min atzad shmei tiltul. Handling muktzah indirectly is considered to be handling, and it's also Umar Savar. Rabbi the Malakish holds lo shmei tiltul. It's not considered to be tiltul, and there's no problem of muktzah. So indeed, this point of contention is the machlokes between these shittas as well. Says Marloi, no, the Kuliyam, everybody holds the tiltul min atzad shmei tiltul. Indirect handling of muktzah is considered to be tiltul muktzah and sasu. V'ainu time of the Rishon Malakish. This is the reason of Rav Shimon Lakish who allows handling the mace directly. We're speaking about handling the mace directly, not min atzad, not indirectly. Why is that allowed? Because the person is in a state of great distress for fear that the lake of the fire will consume the mace. If the Chum do not allow him to handle the mace even directly and move him out of harm's way, he might actually extinguish the fire. Therefore, there's a special allowance here in the place of Dleika. So the Bride is not speaking about indirect handling, we're speaking direct handling. According to Tanakama, even by a fire, one cannot move the mace. According to Rishon Lakish, there's a special allowance for concern that he might go and put out the fire. So this has no relation to the previous discussion. Omar Yehuda ben Shila, Omar Asim, Rav Yochanan, halacha ki Yehuda ben Lakish b'meis, that one may handle a mace and directly move him out of harm's way, out of a fire, for concern that he might extinguish the fire. So in conclusion, we have two halachas here regarding handling a mace. Number one, a mace hamutal b'chama was lying in the sun. We have two shittas. We have Rabbi Yehuda Mashmo tells us there are actually two options available. Number one, he can place a kikar or a tinik on top of the mace. By doing so, he makes the mace into a basis, a support, a basis of davar hamutar, and therefore he can handle the mace in that manner. Or, if he merely rolls them from one bed to the other, that's considered to be tiltul manatzad, an indirect handling of muktzah, which is mutar. According to Chanani bar Shlamya, the second option is not available. The only way you can do it is by placing the kikar or tinik on the mace and moving him away in that manner. We proceed with the halach of a mace who is in harm's way on account of a lake of a fire, which perhaps will come in and harm the mace. According to Tanakama, one may not pick up the mace and lift him out of harm's way. According to Yehuda ben Lakish, one may do so even directly, for concern that perhaps the person out of distress will go out and put out the fire to protect the mace. The Chum allowed even direct handling of muksa under these circumstances, and the Gemara concluded indeed that the halacha follows this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish. So, time for a chazorah on today's daf. We began with the halacha stated in the Mishnah: one may not place a kli under dripping oil, which is muksa. Based on that, Rav Chizda taught us one may not place a kli under an egg, which is muksa, but he can place it over the egg to cover it. We have two approaches. What is the basis? What is the reasoning behind this distinction? We have Rabbah, we have Rav Yosef. Rabbah tells us that the underlying principle we're dealing with is the halacha of ein kli nital. A kli cannot be moved only if he's doing it for the sake of a non-muksa item. He can't move a kli to help and aid and benefit, come to the assistance of a muksa item. Therefore, says Rabbah, he can't place it underneath an egg which is muksa. However, over the egg, by doing so, he's protecting the egg. So if it's a hatzolah mitzuya, if it's a common occurrence that one needs to take this precaution on Shabbos, in that case, this shimush falls within the realm of tzarech Shabbos and its mutter. Rav Yosef adopted a different approach. He said the underlying principle here is the halacha of asur levatel kli mechanai. One may not nullify, be mavatel, the use of a kli on Shabbos by making it forming it into a basis, a support for muktzah, which will prohibit moving this item, moving this kli on Shabbos. He's nullifying its use. He can't do that on Shabbos. Therefore, says Rav Yosef, it doesn't matter whether it's hatzalah mitzuya or hatzalah she'ena mitzuya, whether it's a common need or not a common need, he cannot nullify the use of a kli on Shabbos. Therefore, he can't place it under an egg, but over an egg. That's not a problem because he's merely covering the egg. He's not nullifying the use of the kli in any which way. The Gemara proceeded that there's actually a shita that is chaylik, disagrees with Rav Chizda. That is the shita of Yitzchak, who tells us that one may not be mataltal a kli for the sake of muktzah, whether to place it under the muktzah or over the muktzah, it doesn't matter. However, according to Rav Yitzchak, once he lifts the kli for a davar mutar, for a shimush heter on Shabbos for a valid reason, for instance, he needs the makom of the kli, it's legitimate, he's getting engaged and involved in this kli for a tzarech davar mutar. In that case, he may proceed and conclude this maisa and place this kli anywhere he would like, even if he's doing it in a manner which he protects a muktzah item. The Gemara proceeded with the halacha of placing a mat over a beehive. The Gemara had two approaches. We're speaking about either, even in the winter, because there are some honeycombs there, which were designated for personal use, but he must make sure not to trap those bees, and we're following Shittas of Yehuda. The second approach was, we're not speaking about the winter, we're speaking about spring or fall, when we have sun, we have rain, and certainly we have edible honey in there, since the bees are producing honey during those seasons. We conclude with the halacha of moving around a mace out of the chama, out of sun. According to Rav Yehuda ben Shmuel, he has two options: either by placing the kikar or tinik on the mace and moving him in that manner, or by rolling him from bed to bed. According to Rav Chanani bar Shlamya, the only option available is the kikar or tinik. We finally proceeded with the halacha of moving a mace out of harm's way when there's a fire. Can he actually lift the mace away from the fire? Says the Tanakama, no, it's not allowed. Rav Yehuda ben Lakish says, yes, that is allowed, for concern that perhaps a person out of distress will put out the fire. The Chacham allowed him to handle the muktzah, the mace, directly in this circumstance.